Our next section is scaling lesions. Basically, that means psoriasis, eczema, psoriasis. Eczema and psoriasis are almost interchangeable terms. Okay? Now, the difference about psoriasis from most of the other things is that psoriasis is scaling, but atopic dermatitis is not. Atopic dermatitis is itching. This is like people who have mast cells with a seizure disorder. Psoriasis. You see this? It's on the flexor or the extensor surface. Is it on the flexor or is it on the extensor surface? Is it on the flexor or is it on the extensor surface? Is it on the flexor or is it on the extensor surface? It's on the extensor surface. Psoriasis, scaling, extensor. Psoriasis, scaling, extensor surfaces. But scaling. Atopic is going to present mostly like itchy people. A lot of eye problems, eye and face, and eye and face. Psoriasis is not very much on the face, but atopic is often on the face. Atopic is often on the face. Itchy face, eyes, itching, associated with dryness and drying out and using soaps that are too much. You're showering too much. Stay dirty, stay greasy, stay oily. It'll help your atopic dermatitis. Psoriasis, scaling lesions. What's one thing they have in common? I'll tell you one thing they have in common. One thing that they have in common is that they're both treated, if they're localized, they're both treated with topical steroids. What's one thing they have in common? They're both treated with topical steroids. What's one thing that they both have in common? They're both treated with topical steroids. That's one thing that they both have in common. They are both treated with topical steroids. Now, xerosis here. You see this word xerosis? Xerosis is a $5 word for dry skin. See where it says asteatotic? A means without. Steat means fat. Dry skin that's scaling because I'm without fat, without fat. Well, every time you worry about your oily skin, I want you to remember that as much as you worry about your oily skin, it's much worse to be overly dry. Overly dry skin causes skin cancer, cracks, breaks, infection. Ugh. Asteatotic. My skin has no fat. Asteatotic, without fat in my skin. And I dry up and I blow away. What's the treatment for this person who has no grease on their skin? Hey doc, it hurts when I do that. Don't do that. Hey doc, it hurts when my skin is dry. Grease up, honey. Lubricate yourself. That could be everything from Lachydrin and Lubriderm and Nivea and Vaseline to WD-40 and unsalted butter. Doesn't matter, just grease up. Psoriasis, on the other hand, is much more complex. Psoriasis gets topical steroids. Psoriasis and atopic dermatitis, stay lubricated. The biggest reason to stay lubricated here is that atopic dermatitis, the major thing is that the more you itch, the more you scratch. And the more you scratch, the worse you feel. Because when you itchy and you start going into the itchy and scratchy show, the itchy and scratchy show, I'm sure that's coincidental, causes you to have infections in the skin. You impetiganize the skin for infections. You impetiganize the skin for an infection. 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 Atopic, scratch, you get infections. Okay? So therefore, the major issue, stay greasy, don't use hot water, don't use harsh soaps. Stay greasy, don't use hot water, don't use harsh soaps. Stay greasy, don't use hot water, don't use harsh soaps. You won't scratch as much, you won't itch as much, you won't drive the staphylococcus under the skin. Control the itching and the scratching. Antihistamines, loratadine and cetirizine and fexofenadine. loratadine, and cetirizine, and fexofenadine helps treat the itchy and scratchy show. It helps treat the itchy and scratchy show. Psoriasis, scaling. The difference between psoriasis and atopic dermatitis is that psoriasis has antibodies attacking the epidermis. Because there's antibodies attacking the epidermis, you can use other antibodies cooked up in a laboratory, monoclonal antibodies, that will take the antibodies that attack your skin and pull them out of circulation. Antibodies against other antibodies and pull them out of circulation. Adalimumab, efalimumab, these biological agents help control that psoriasis. Now, the other things about psoriasis is that psoriasis can be treated with topical vitamin A, and vitamin D derivative. Vitamin A, D, and D derivatives like calcipotriene. You see that word triene? D3, vitamin D3, calcipotriene, vitamin D3. So vitamin D3 can control those lesions because it helps compel the differentiation of the cells. It helps compel maturation of the cells. It helps compel them grow up. Stop being such a baby and making psoriasis. Grow up and you become normal. Vitamin A, retinoic acid. Vitamin D, calcipotriene. Now, why I use these is to help me get you off of steroids. Steroids, very hard to cover large surface areas. Steroids, very deforming in the long term, skin atrophy, inhibiting collagen growth. Steroids, let's look at the skin in this chick's hand again. Look at this here. Not so pretty as it is now. How'd you like to use steroids in that? It becomes thin and blue as the blood vessels start to appear through because the psoriasis, the steroids make the skin even thinner, the collagen even thinner and weaker. No good. No good. That's why what we want to do is we want to use something that will control the psoriasis without making the skin any thinner. That's why we use topical vitamin A and D, calcipotriene. Adalimumab and efalimumab. Adalimumab and efalimumab. Adalimumab and efalimumab are biological agents that control the antibodies that attack the skin. Well, what happens if you have disseminated disease that's too widespread to put topicals? What if you have your whole body covered? Topicals, very inefficient. Ultraviolet light, UV light. Ultraviolet light to control it, large surface areas. UV light to control it, large surface areas. UV light to control it and large surface areas. Okay? UV light to control it and large surface areas. The other thing that can be used to control it in the long term for psoriasis, well, the very last thing that you want to use is methotrexate, because methotrexate has all sorts of systemic side effects like liver fibrosis. Yuck, oh man. Yuck, oh. We can use coal tars, anthralins, but coal tars are messy and, you know, it comes across a lot like coal tar. Blech. Blech. Who wants to smear themselves with coal tar? Okay? Ultraviolet light, coal tars, methotrexate to keep it controlled. Biological agents and vitamin A and D derivatives locally. Now, atopic dermatitis also gets topical steroids and lubricants, but the difference is that atopic dermatitis is much more of a lymphocyte destabilization, mast cells destabilization. So therefore, what we want to use is special drugs to help control our lymphocytes called tacrolimus, pimecrolimus, sirolimus. Tacrolimus, sirolimus, pimecrolimus. Tacrolimus, pimecrolimus, sirolimus. Tacrolimus, sirolimus, pimecrolimus. Tacrolimus, sirolimus, pimecrolimus. That means that these are things where those lymphocytes are being controlled by tacrolimus, sirolimus, pimecrolimus. Tacrolimus, sirolimus, pimecrolimus. These are things that control T cells but have a lot less adverse effects than steroids. These are things that basically these drugs, for many of you who are out there in video land, audio land, out in the mystical, I'm reaching you out wherever you are. Here we go. Ready? I'm reaching out to you. You may be thousands of miles. I'm in New York City. And where are you? Here, ready? Oh, sending you a hug. Sending you a hug. Okay, so these drugs, I think that these, for many of you, is going to be the first time you've ever heard of these. But a year from now, you're going to see them all over the place. Why? Because this is like steroid light. What this is they inhibit lymphocytes without the adverse effects of steroids. They're useful organ transplant rejection. They're useful to prevent your bone marrow transplant rejection. They're useful for atopic autoimmune things. They're useful to prevent coronary stents. Did you know that half the stents in the United States that get put in are impregnated with sirolimus? Inhibit T cells. I was walking along the beach on the island of Rapa Nui, which is commonly known as Easter Island, with those weird head sculptures out in there in the South Atlantic, thinking that space aliens should have had much better taste in art than a bunch of big heads with big noses. And on the beach in Rapa Nui in the South Atlantic, I find a soil sample that has a fungus that makes sirolimus, rapamycin from Rapa Nui, where you find things. And the next thing you know, we're using it to control your atopic dermatitis, and we're using it to control your organ transplant rejection. Fantastico, how wonderful. Don't dry yourself out. Don't use harsh soaps. Don't wash so much. Stay a little dirty, why don't you? Don't itch, don't scratch. You won't get infections. You won't get infections, you won't itch and scratch. Antihistamines, topical steroids, and use these drugs to control the disease so you don't need the topical steroids. Asteatotic eczema, just grease up, just grease up. Next subject, atopic dermatitis. This is showing that atopic dermatitis has a lot of facial involvement. You see the person scraping up and pushing on the nose because it itches. Cut your fingernail short so you don't scratch the crap out of yourself. Atopic dermatitis. Now, seborrheic dermatitis. Remember that this, when we said seborrheic, you see that word seborrheic? Flow of sebaceous glands. Flow of sebum. The sebum, it flows. The sebum, it flows. The flow of sebum. The sebum, it flows. The flow of sebum. The sebum, it flows. Sebaceous flow. Sebaceous flow. Sebaceous flow. This seborrheic dermatitis, this guy's face, this guy's got a hypersensitivity reaction. See, it's kind of red and oily, red and oily, red and oily. In seborrheic dermatitis, that red and oily reaction is a hypersensitivity to a fungus on the skin. Pityrosporon orbiculare. Why, it sounds like an Italian sports car. What do you drive? I drive an Alfa Romeo. What do you drive? I drive a Lamborghini. What do you drive? I drive a Pityrosporon orbiculare, right all over your face. This is basically dandruff. But you know what? I didn't get $180,000 in debt in medical school to say dandruff on my face. Pityrosporon orbiculare results in a hypersensitivity reaction on the skin, resulting in redness, oiling, and flaking. Redness, oiling, and flaking. Because it's a hypersensitivity to a fungus, seborrheic dermatitis can be treated with both a steroid, for the hypersensitivity, and a topical antifungal for the fungus. That's why it's weird. It's weird. It is the only skin infection which will say both the steroid and an antifungal, because it's a hypersensitivity to a fungus. A hypersensitivity to a fungus. Seborrheic, my flow of my sebum, flowing off my face. Dermatitis. Stasis dermatitis. Stasis means venous stasis, and the skin is inflamed from venous stasis. There is no treatment except to keep your legs up. Keep your legs up and support hose. Keep your legs up and support hose. Next slide, contact dermatitis. This is a person whose feet have been in contact, well, with frankly almost anything. Contact dermatitis has been basically this person's feet have been association with, it could be a soap, it could be an oil, it could be a detergent. Now, contact dermatitis, most often when people get contact dermatitis, the most common cause of contact dermatitis is people who have been contacting metal. Contact dermatitis, going to learn how to spell that someday. Dermatitis, usually metal, like nickel, metal, like nickel, metal, like nickel, and metal, like nickel. And metal, like nickel, results in a person. Metal, like nickel, results in a person where it has over the jewelry and over your belt buckle having a hypersensitivity reaction. What's probably the most common contact dermatitis that the common person gets? I used to use the same word twice. Must be very common. Common. Poison ivy. Poison ivy. Poison ivy is a contact dermatitis. And all contact dermatitises are treated the same way. Remove the source of contact, and if it's really bad, you'll use topical steroids. Remove the source of contact, and if it's really bad, you'll use topical steroids. Remove the source of contact, and if it's really bad, you'll use topical steroids. You'll use topical steroids. Now, secondary syphilis. Secondary syphilis has a rash. Secondary syphilis has a positive VDRL or RPR. VDRL or RPR in all cases. Has a positive VDRL or RPR in all cases. Secondary syphilis. Well, how are we going to tell, next slide, that apart from pityriasis rosea? Pityriasis rosea in this next slide is a diffuse macular rash. Diffuse macular rash. Diffuse macular rash. Pityriasis rosea looks very similar to secondary syphilis. Pityriasis rosea can look very similar to secondary syphilis. But pityriasis rosea has a negative VDRL. Pityriasis rosea is not on the hands and the feet as secondary syphilis is. Pityriasis rosea has an initial quote-unquote herald patch. A first lesion that comes first, the first lesion that appears before the rest of the skin lesions. A herald patch. A big lesion, and then later it disseminates. Negative VDRL, and not on the palms and the soles, and the palms and the soles, and the palms and the soles, pityriasis rosea. This is on the palms and the soles, positive VDRL, and no herald patch. That's how you will tell them apart.